share with you all and the members of our jury my thoughts on why it's time that we should start exploring the use of financial incentives in our organ donation system. Oh shoot. There we go. So I want to start by taking kind of a big picture perspective here. I think everyone here is familiar, sometimes all too familiar, with the reality that the number of people in need of an organ transplant is greater than the number of organs that are available through donation, and that our current system of organ donation that doesn't allow for financial incentives is really not meeting this need. And so my overall point for today is that we really need to keep an open mind when it comes to strategies to increase organ donation. This is really a life and death issue for so many people. And if we're going to place limits on what we deem to be acceptable in terms of strategies to increase organ donation, then these limits really need to be based in evidence. And I would argue that there's just not enough evidence to justify a complete prohibition on the use of any form of financial incentives. So when we talk about financial incentives, I think sort of the immediate reaction that kind of comes to mind with a lot of people is this idea of recipients purchasing organs from donors or vendors. But that's really an example at one extreme end of the spectrum. When we talk about financial incentives, there's actually a whole spectrum of different mechanisms and strategies that are being talked about. And it's sort of this more moderate group of incentive mechanisms that I want to focus on today as potentially realistic strategies and steps forward in our donation system. And so right now, where we kind of currently draw the line is at reimbursement. And that's relatively uncontroversial, and it's the idea that donors, especially living donors, should not be out of pocket for any expenses in relation to donation. So we reimburse people for out-of-pocket expenses and lost wages to an extent. But anything kind of beyond that line is really questionable under our current legislation across the country, and to some is viewed as ethically problematic. And the idea there is that people should not financially benefit. There shouldn't be a net financial benefit as a result of donation. And so that's why some people would draw the line here. And strategies on that sort of side of things are often sort of termed as the removal of disincentives as opposed to incentives, but that's basically what we're talking about there. But then other people would draw the line a little further down, and there's sort of this distinction, and again, I think this is sort of a game of definition here, differentiating between what some would view as ethically acceptable incentives, which are acceptable, versus payments, which are seen as bad. And these are terms that are used to try and delineate between these ethically good things and ethically bad, but really it's unclear where the line is being drawn or where it should be drawn. I think like to some people, a tax credit might be an incentive, but to other people, they might classify that as a payment. So I think we need to sort of get beyond these labels, and we need to really look at what are the underlying reasons why there's this hesitancy to move down the spectrum, and what justifications are being offered in support of this prohibition against financial incentives. So to start out, there's sort of this idea that there's this international consensus out there that is anti-financial incentives, that's anti-payment for organs, and that because of this level of agreement, this is the position that we should adopt, and we should be very hesitant about moving away from that. And I would like to point out, first of all, that this argument, this debate that we're talking about, this isn't something like, the climate change debate where you have a preponderance of scientific evidence and opinion on one side that is really something that should carry the day, and then a few sort of nutty outliers causing trouble. This is more of a situation, I would argue, this is a legitimate debate. There's actual room for discussion, and there's room for rational arguments on both sides. So if I can't convince you of anything here today, I hope I can at least convince you of that this is a legitimate debate to be had, and we should question the notion that just because there is some level of perhaps agreement out there against financial incentives, that's necessarily what we should base our policy on. But further, I would question the notion or the strength that there actually is this sort of consensus out there. And surely in the academic literature and amongst bioethicists, we can see that there actually is a move, and there's people that are now calling for the use of financial incentives to try and increase our organ donation rates. And certainly amongst the public, it definitely cannot be said that there is a consensus against the use of financial incentives. A recent poll or survey of the Canadian public concluded that the general public views regulated financial incentives for living and deceased donation to be generally acceptable. And so we really need to look at what is wrong with the idea of paying people for organ donation. And here I think we need to differentiate again between harms, which are things that are empirically testable. There are things that we can talk about in terms of policies and how are we going to address these harms, and are they things that we can address? Are they inevitable? And this is where I think the conversation needs to be focused. And we need to differentiate that between some of the more inherent symbolic concerns that are going on. And as some authors really bluntly stated, saving lives is more important than abstract moral concerns. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. And so what are some of these underlying concerns with payment for organs? And so I think one of them is this idea that our organ donation system is based on this notion of altruism, and financial incentives are going to undermine that sense of altruism. And associated with this is also the concern that using financial incentives is going to actually decrease the amount of altruistic donors, which could lead to an overall decrease in the amount of organ donation. And that's the kind of harm that is empirically testable, something that we can talk about. But I think we need to, first of all, take note that there's no evidence that that would be the result with financial incentives, and we need to question the presumption that that would be the case. And instead, we have some survey evidence that indicates that using financial incentives in Canada would actually lead to a net increase in the amount of donation. Now, I'm the first one to admit that survey evidence about people's future behavior is not really the best source of evidence. Oftentimes what people indicate they would do in a survey differs from what they would actually do in real life. But this is kind of the best evidence we have on this, and at a minimum, it gives us reason to question whether financial incentives would automatically lead to a decrease in donation. But getting back to this idea that incentives could corrupt our system of altruism, I think we need to question the proposition that financial payments for donation is necessarily in opposition or conflict to the notion of altruism. And studies looking at egg donors in the United States, which are often compensated for their donation, have found that donors cited both altruism and financial compensation as reasons for their donation. And so this questions the assumption that incentives would necessarily obliterate all altruistic motives. And that's really just too simplistic a picture of human behavior and decision making. I think there's also some reason to question this idea that our system, which is purely altruistic, is going to be corrupted. Because although organ donation is an incredibly wonderful thing, it is a very largely selfless act, I don't know that we can actually say that it is 100% purely altruistic. And that's because the decision to be an organ donor is incredibly complex. It is a very big decision, and there are many, many different factors that come into play that people take into consideration, rightfully so. And, some of these can be a sense of obligation or duty or sense of value, self-worth, all of these things, which are completely legitimate factors to take into account, but they're not necessarily 100% altruistic. And that's okay. As the American Society for Transplantation noted, if we were to limit donation to those motivated only by pure altruism, it is likely that donors would be few and far between. And so we can accept the fact that our donation system is not necessarily 100% altruistic, and that there are all these different factors that come into play in a decision to donate. But then when we add financial benefit into the equation, it suddenly becomes objectionable and like this terrible notion that we shouldn't accept. And I think part of this is due to this fear around the issue of commodification. Oh dear. I tried to use the formatting got a little mixed up. I tried to use a really scary font here to try and show the fear that surrounds this notion of commodification, and I failed here. If anyone has any more threatening fonts they would like to send my way, please do. But I put this term in quotes because it's often raised by those that are opposed to financial incentives, but it's often raised without any definition or context or without explanation about the actual harms that this concept is supposed to embody. And it's used in a way that sort of presupposes that commodification is bad without further explanation. And so for some examples here in this paper, they note once a commodity, always a commodity, and that commodification is a slippery slope towards commercialism. Okay, and why is that bad though? Like, we don't know. Oftentimes it's also brought up here that it brings an unacceptable commerce to the value of human life. But what makes it unacceptable? In the same paper noted, the commodification essentially in and of itself is a harm, but why? Why all this concern about commodification? It's also sometimes tied to the idea of human dignity, which is also kind of an amorphous subjective concept. And colleagues of mine looked at the use of this term, commodification, in the stem cell research debate. And I would say that some of their conclusions are equally applicable to the context here. What they essentially found was that the argument is rarely more nuanced than commodification is bad because it leads to more commodification. And that is really difficult to determine the exact harms that are meant to be conveyed by the use of this term. But I think if you really get down to it, when it comes to talking about harms with financial incentives, what the big concerns are coercion and exploitation. But I think when it comes to coercion, the idea that financial incentives are necessarily coercive implies that the use of a financial incentive somehow removes a person's ability to appreciate the risks involved in the decision to donate. And it also sort of implies that the use of a financial incentive as part of your motivation to donate can never really be in your best interests. And I think that we need to question these assumptions. There are other circumstances in society in which we allow people to take risks that put their health or their lives at risk, and we don't necessarily view those as being coercive. There are lots of jobs in our society that are really risky and dangerous, and sometimes we pay a premium to try and incentivize people to take these positions. And yet we don't view that as coercive. We respect people's autonomy to be able to weigh these different factors, the risks as well as financial benefits, and make a decision about what's in their best interest. Because usually it's the individual who's able to determine what's in his or her own best interests. And so again, I think we need to acknowledge that limiting what people can do with their bodies is not respecting their autonomy as individuals. And certainly there are limits to our autonomy in society when it comes to harming other people, or in some circumstances, harming yourself. But I would argue in this circumstance, we're not talking about, organ donation is not something that is so inherently dangerous and harmful that no one could ever possibly consent to it rationally. Our entire living donation system as it stands right now is actually based on people's ability and our respect for unpaid donors' autonomy to be able to weigh these risks and determine what's in their best interest. And so why would we allow people and respect people's autonomy in that situation, but not in the other situation where they're making the exact same decision based on the exact same level of risk, but it's just because they may be influenced to some degree by other financial concerns that it's something that we should limit. And so I would be the first one to say that if these other financial factors that are being taken into consideration are so strong that they were compromising someone's ability to really appreciate the risks of donation, and to the point that they don't really understand, they don't appreciate what risks are involved, then that is a problem, and that is a situation that we would need to look at. But I would say that we can mitigate these concerns in the way that we structure our financial incentives, and that not all financial incentive mechanisms are equal in this regard, but we can put adequate safeguards in place. We need to emphasize informed consent, make sure people understand the risks. We need to implement a cooling off period between the time when someone comes forward and says they want to donate and the time that donation actually happens and the payment or financial reward is actually administered. There are a bunch of other incentive mechanisms. In the interest of time, I don't have time to go through them all, but I'm happy to answer some questions about it, about different strategies to try and mitigate the risk of coercion. And then when it comes to exploitation, basically the big concern here is that we're going to have rich people buying organs from the poor. Again, I think that there are many ways we can mitigate against this. We can have a system where payments are fixed, where they're made by the government, and where the organs go to the first person on the wait list, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Also, I think we can have other safeguards to ensure health. But we also need to question the idea that financial incentive mechanisms are going to be utilized most heavily by the most economically disadvantaged people in society. Again, this survey evidence shows actually the opposite, that persons in lower income households are actually less willing to consider donating for payments of $10,000 or $100,000. So this, at a minimum, makes us question whether exploitation and coercion is going to necessarily be the result in a system of financial incentives. So essentially, if there is no evidence of real harm here, the next question is, well, will they work? What is the benefit? And unfortunately here, the lack of evidence sort of cuts both ways. There's an abundance of survey evidence that indicates that some level of financial incentives would be useful in increasing donation, but again, that's not ideal basis for evidence. But I think we need to acknowledge here that the reason why there's a lack of evidence is because there has been this blanket prohibition, so we haven't been able to test any of these mechanisms to see what's going to work, what's not going to work, what the different implications are. So you might ask, if there's no real evidence of harm and there's not great evidence of benefit, why should we take this step forward? And I would say that we need to lift the blanket prohibition to get the evidence we need to make smart policy decisions that are going to be beneficial and safe. And secondly, I would say that under the current system, we know that there actually is harm going on, and it's demonstrated. There's evidence of it, and we see that in the hundreds of people in Canada that die every year waiting for organs. And this comes back to sort of my big picture approach. If there's something we can do to try and address that, then I think it's worth trying. And so basically we need evidence. I think we could do this by having different pilot programs to try out different incentive mechanisms and see what's effective, what's not, what's going to work, what's going to be safe. We need to get that evidence we need. It's not going to be an easy step. There are potential legal hurdles we have to overcome. Policy, it's going to require a lot of engagement with different people that are fortunately in this room here today. But although it's not going to be an easy path forward, I think that it's a worthwhile one that I would encourage the jury to consider. Thank you very much.